When it comes to haunted lands, perhaps no place in the United States carries as many chilling and mysterious stories as Skinwalker Ranch. Located in Utah, it has become a symbol of terror, where supernatural phenomena and frightening legends intertwine. But are these stories merely rumors, or are they part of a terrifying reality? The narrator begins. Skinwalker Ranch is not just a farm, it is a gateway to things we cannot explain. From strange lights in the sky, eerie noises in the dead of night, to creatures that don't belong to this world, all of it makes this place a cursed land. Nicknamed the Gateway to Hell, Skinwalker Ranch was once home to the Sherman family, who abandoned the property after 2 harrowing years. They spoke of shape-shifting creatures, strange lights tearing through the night sky, and the unshakable feeling of being constantly watched. Years later, anyone brave enough to set foot there carries the same experience: sheer, overwhelming fear. But what makes this place so terrifying? The narrator continues, his voice low and haunting. It's because this land is tied to Navajo legend, where malevolent sorcerers, known as Skinwalkers, are said to lurk in the shadows. Tonight, you will follow a group of curious researchers who have decided to tempt fate by staying overnight at Skinwalker Ranch. Will they uncover the truth, or will they become part of the horrifying story this land hides? Let's find out, if you dare. That night, as the clock struck 9 p.m., the research team, James, Sarah, and Kyle, stepped into the grounds of Skinwalker Ranch. The sky was pitch black, with the crescent moon faintly piercing through thick clouds. A chilling wind blew, carrying strange sounds from afar. The ranch lay desolate, its decrepit buildings cloaked in a layer of dust, as though forgotten by both people and time. They decided to set up camp near an old livestock pen, rumored to be the center of the mysterious phenomena. James, the team leader, had brought an array of modern equipment: a thermal camera, an EVP recorder, and an EMF detector. Everything was meticulously arranged, yet none of them could shake the oppressive, heavy atmosphere that seemed to press down on their shoulders. Time passed slowly, and at first, everything seemed eerily quiet. But then the strangeness began. Somewhere in the darkness, they heard footsteps, slow, deliberate, and unmistakably approaching. James turned on the thermal camera, scanning in the direction of the sound, but the screen showed only an expanse of impenetrable darkness. Probably just the wind, Sarah said, trying to reassure herself, though her voice trembled. Near midnight, the air grew even more stifling. The wind died down, leaving behind an unnerving stillness. Kyle, tasked with monitoring the EMF detector, suddenly shouted, "James, come here!" The detector's going crazy. The needle on the device spun wildly, with readings far beyond normal levels. At the same time, the temperature plummeted, sending shivers through them all. Suddenly, a loud noise erupted from the direction of the livestock pen, a sound like something clawing violently at rotting wood. James grabbed the camera and ran toward it, only to freeze in terror at what he saw. A shadowy figure, tall and indistinct, standing motionless in the corner of the pen. Its eyes glowed a fiery red, staring directly at him through the darkness. Without warning, the shadow moved, charging toward them. Sarah screamed as her flashlight illuminated the creature, a humanoid figure, emaciated with grayish skin and razor-sharp claws. It was neither human nor animal. It was Skinwalker. Instinct took over, and the three of them ran. Their frantic footsteps mixed with the creature's guttural growls, echoing through the empty expanse. The darkness seemed to close in, swallowing everything, and there appeared to be no escape from this place. They realized then that Skinwalker Ranch was not just a legend, it was a living nightmare. When James, Sarah, and Kyle sprinted away from the livestock pen, they felt as if they were being consumed by an oppressive darkness, one that not only obscured their vision, but also crushed their will. They ran desperately toward a nearby hill, hoping to gain a vantage point over the ranch to find an escape route. But as they reached the hilltop, an extraordinary sight brought them to a halt. Above Skinwalker Ranch, the sky seemed torn apart. A brilliant blue-white beam of light emerged, spiraling with unnatural flashes of energy. It wasn't like any natural phenomenon they had ever seen. It resembled a portal to another world, radiant yet exuding an unsettling, suffocating coldness. James tried to adjust his camera, aiming it at the strange light. Suddenly, the camera began to shake violently as if disrupted by interference, and the signal was entirely lost. Sarah screamed, pointing to the field below. A large triangular object, faintly glowing, hovered just above the ground. It emitted no sound, drifting silently, with flickering lights along its edges as though scanning its surroundings. At the same time, a low humming noise began to build, growing louder and causing the ground beneath them to tremble. Small cracks formed in the earth, snaking toward the livestock pen. Kyle stared at the area where, moments before, they had seen the Skinwalker. But now, in that exact spot, there were enormous footprints, unlike anything belonging to a creature of this world. The light from the triangular object suddenly intensified, illuminating the entire area. James blinked, trying to see more clearly through the dazzling glow, and then he saw something chilling. The creature they had encountered earlier, the Skinwalker, was kneeling under the light, as if submitting to a higher power. Strange symbols materialized in the air, floating as if drawn with light, spiraling around the creature. The Skinwalker's growls had ceased, replaced by a low murmuring sound, a blend of countless indistinct voices whispering in unison. Sarah stumbled backward, trembling, as she felt something penetrating her mind, as though her very thoughts were being observed. In that instant, the light became blindingly bright, forcing all three of them to shield their eyes. When the light faded, the triangular object was gone, and the Skinwalker had vanished entirely, leaving behind an eerie void of silence. James glanced at his watch, and terror gripped them. The hands of the watch had stopped at 2:43 a.m., even though they felt everything had occurred within mere minutes. Time itself had been distorted, and they realized that at Skinwalker Ranch, the boundary between reality and the supernatural had been erased. Darkness reclaimed the ranch, but this time it carried a deathly silence. The three of them understood with chilling certainty that they had trespassed into a place they were never meant to enter. The three descended the hill, but each step felt unbearably heavy, as if an invisible force was pulling them down. The air around them grew thick and suffocating, carrying the acrid scent of rust and damp earth. Shadows flickered between the distant trees, appearing and disappearing, causing Sarah to glance nervously over her shoulder repeatedly. As they neared the livestock pen, a chilling sound echoed, a long, grating screech like metal scraping against metal, reverberating from deep within the darkness. James turned on his flashlight, but its beam barely pierced the oppressive shadows. When the light fell on the pen, their hearts froze. The previously secured door now hung wide open, its wooden frame splintered and clawed apart as though attacked by something of immense strength. Kyle pointed inside the pen, where the cattle lay scattered across the ground. Their bodies were grotesquely twisted, their eyes wide open but devoid of life. The muddy ground was littered with enormous footprints, unlike any they had ever seen, each impression sinking deep as though made by a creature of extraordinary weight. Suddenly, a low, guttural screech erupted from inside the pen, an inhuman, bone-chilling sound that sent shivers down their spines. The three stumbled backward as a towering, misshapen figure emerged from the darkness. Its glowing red eyes burned like smoldering embers, cutting through the night. Its body was covered in wrinkled, grayish skin, and its unnaturally long arms ended in gleaming, razor-sharp claws. James trembled as he lifted his camera, but the lens immediately flickered with static, overwhelmed by strange, unexplainable interference. The creature paused at the edge of the shadows, its fiery eyes fixed on the group. Then, without warning, it charged forward with unnatural speed, its movements fluid and predatory, as if the darkness itself was its domain. Sarah screamed, and the group bolted from the pen, sprinting desperately toward the truck parked at the end of the road. Just as they neared the truck, a blinding light appeared above them. The vehicle shook violently, as if being lifted off the ground. A strange beam from the sky shone down, accompanied by an ear-piercing roar. Their bodies froze in place, paralyzed, unable to move even a finger. In that moment, they understood that it wasn't just the Skinwalker they were facing. There were forces far beyond human comprehension controlling this place. The light vanished abruptly, leaving them in a suffocating silence. The creature was gone, and the truck lay tilted to one side, smoke rising from its hood. James crawled to the vehicle, fumbling to open the door in sheer panic. They clambered inside as the engine sputtered and whined, but refused to start. From the distance came the same harrowing screech, drawing closer and closer, a chilling reminder that the creature had never truly left. The truck's engine finally roared to life, and it sped down the dusty road. In the darkness, the headlights could only illuminate a few meters ahead, but it was enough to reveal shadows moving along both sides of the road. No one said a word. The sound of panicked breathing and racing heartbeats drowned out all thoughts. As they approached the main gate of Skinwalker Ranch, the gate appeared twisted and deformed, as though an invisible force had contorted it. James, sitting in the driver's seat, shouted, "Hold on tight, we're almost out!" But just as the wheels were about to cross the boundary, the engine suddenly died. Darkness enveloped them. The truck's lights, the camera, and even the flashlight stopped working. The silence became so oppressive it was suffocating. Then, from deep within the shadows, slow, heavy footsteps began to echo, as if something was approaching from all directions. The three of them sat frozen in the truck, barely daring to breathe. But the footsteps didn't stop. From behind the truck, a deformed hand with long claws scraped violently against the rear window, leaving cracks in the glass. Sarah screamed, but her voice was cut off by a high-pitched screech from outside. Suddenly, the blue light from the sky reappeared, shining directly onto the truck. This time, however, it did not bring a sense of rescue. It was a sentence of doom. Their bodies were pulled from the truck and hurled into the air like lifeless dolls. The last image James saw before everything went black was the creature's glowing red eyes, standing under the strange blue light, staring directly at him. The next morning, the truck was found outside the boundary of Skinwalker Ranch, but there was no trace of James, Sarah, or Kyle. Only strange black scorch marks remained on the ground, and an inexplicable chill hung over everything nearby. From that point onward, the area was sealed off, but eerie screeches and strange lights continued to appear at night, a haunting reminder that Skinwalker Ranch never truly lets anyone escape. I was once an ambitious researcher, believing that science could explain everything. But then Skinwalker Ranch, the place known as the dark zone of supernatural phenomena, changed everything. I didn't come here to chase ghosts or demons. I came to prove that every strange occurrence has a scientific explanation. Perhaps that arrogance was my first mistake. On the first night I set foot on the ranch, the atmosphere felt suffocating, as if it were being choked by some bizarre energy. The wind howled across the barren fields, carrying sounds like eerie whispers echoing from some distant place. The night sky was crystal clear, yet it was illuminated by strange, fleeting flashes of light that appeared and disappeared without warning. The locals living nearby refused to speak about the ranch, only warning us, "Leave before it's too late." I remember laughing at those warnings, partly because of curiosity, but mostly because of the confidence of someone who believed that reason could conquer anything. But everything began to shift when we camped near a corner of the ranch, the place locals ominously referred to as the blind spot. That night, I felt eyes watching me from the darkness, tracking my every move. At first, I dismissed it as the fatigue-induced imagination of someone worn out from a long trip. But as footsteps drew closer, an icy chill ran down my spine. In that moment, I knew I was no longer safe. And that's where the terrifying story, beyond anything my scientific understanding could grasp, began. Skinwalker Ranch, by day, looks strangely peaceful, but when night falls, it transforms into a living entity, exhaling pure terror. On the second night, my team and I began placing sensor equipment around the ranch to monitor any unusual activity. The night sky was pitch black, starless, with only the faint beams of our flashlights cutting through the darkness. At around 11 p.m., one of the electromagnetic sensors placed in the western area suddenly blared loudly. The data indicated a strange fluctuation, as if a powerful energy source was moving underground. Accompanied by two teammates, I went to investigate. The area was near large, weather-worn rocks, which the locals claimed had once been the site of Navajo shamanic rituals. The air here felt dense, with the smell of damp earth mixed with something indescribably foul, like rotting flesh. As I knelt to examine the device, That same icy chill from the night before crept over me. I looked up and shone my flashlight into the darkness. All I could see were weeds and shadowy trees, but I felt an unmistakable presence. Something was out there, watching, waiting. Somewhere in the night, a sound broke the silence, like footsteps crunching on dry leaves. I quickly aimed my flashlight toward the noise, but there was nothing, only a thin mist that had started to settle over the area. Then it came, a low growl. It wasn't the sound of a wild animal, nor was it the wind. It was deep and guttural, as though it emanated from a throat filled with fury. The team leader signaled for us to back away, but as I turned, the ground beneath me began to tremble. A strange streak of light suddenly flashed across the eastern sky before vanishing in an instant, leaving an even darker void in its wake. We retreated to the main tent to review the data we had collected, but the files were completely corrupted, as if some invisible force had fried the entire hard drive. Our equipment was malfunctioning, and tension was rising among the team. One member, Jeff, muttered under his breath, "This isn't normal anymore. We need to leave." But I couldn't. The phenomena were too bizarre to ignore, and curiosity had overridden my sense of caution. I decided to return to the western area with another teammate, back to the ritual stones, for one last check before deciding whether to retreat. The night seemed darker than ever, the shadows swallowing every beam from our flashlights. When we reached the stones, we discovered something I wished I had never seen. Enormous footprints resembling human tracks, but grotesquely long and distorted. These prints seemed to lead deeper into the darkness, as if beckoning us to follow. I stood there, heart racing, torn between the urge to investigate further and the creeping dread that it might already be too late to turn back. The strange footprints led us to an area where previous data had indicated unusual magnetic field fluctuations. The surroundings grew increasingly bizarre. Massive rocks covered in moss seemed deliberately arranged in a specific pattern, forming a mysterious circle. The air here was unnaturally cold, starkly different from the scorching heat of the daytime. It felt as though we had entered another realm, a place where science and logic no longer held any meaning. A gamma radiation detector I carried suddenly emitted a loud beep, signaling a dramatic spike in radiation levels. The numbers on the screen fluctuated erratically, as if some force was interfering with the system. I tried to recalibrate the device, but it was futile. Meanwhile, a low humming sound resonated from somewhere nearby, resembling the noise of a mechanical engine, yet unlike any equipment we had brought with us. Back at the main tent, the research team attempted to analyze the collected data. However, all the footage from the night vision cameras was either distorted or completely blank, as if an invisible force had erased all evidence. Worse still, the thermal imaging sensors captured vague shapes, large figures moving in the distance, that resembled no known animals. These entities appeared and disappeared in an instant, making any attempt to document them impossible. In the days that followed, we tried various methods to explain these phenomena. A nuclear physicist on the team set up a cloud chamber to detect high-energy atomic particles. Strangely, the chamber functioned for only a few minutes before inexplicably shutting down. Equations, charts, and scientific theories were proposed one after another, but none could explain what we were experiencing. One night, while inspecting area near an old barn, a site locals believed to harbor the presence of the Skinwalker, I heard soft yet chilling whispers. There was no one around, only the beam of my flashlight illuminating the rotting wooden walls. I tried recording the sound with a specialized audio device, but when I played it back, all I could hear was static, even though the whispers had been clear to my ears. The research team began to fall into a state of frustration and helplessness. Every answer we found only led to more questions. Why did the most advanced equipment fail to function within certain areas of the ranch? Were these phenomena natural or deliberately engineered by someone? And most importantly, were we confronting a scientific mystery or something far beyond human comprehension? As the day of our departure from the ranch approached, I realized that Skinwalker Ranch was not a place to seek answers. It was a place where every step forward, every experiment, only drew us deeper into a veil of mystery, a place where the line between reality and the supernatural grew increasingly blurred. The final night at Skinwalker Ranch was thick with tension. The night sky was pitch black, devoid of stars. The wind howled in icy gusts, carrying faint, whisper-like sounds. The team gathered in the control center to monitor the collected data, but no one spoke. Everyone could sense that something unusual was approaching. Suddenly, the monitors began to flicker before flashing bright red. The radar detected a large airborne object moving at an incomprehensible speed directly above the research site. Electromagnetic interference caused the lights in the room to flicker erratically. As we scrambled to investigate, a loud, distorted sound erupted outside, a noise like an explosion, but warped, as though it came from something not of this world. I rushed outside with several team members, our flashlights slicing through the darkness. In the middle of the clearing, a faint, bluish light enveloped the area like an eerie mist. Within the glow, the silhouette of a massive creature emerged. It was unlike anything we had ever seen. Its towering frame and jagged joints seemed alien, as though they didn't belong to a living being. Its eyes glowed a fiery red, burning like embers, and every step it took reverberated with a metallic grinding noise. No one dared to move. Each second felt like an eternity. The creature appeared to sense our presence, yet it didn't charge. Instead, it stood still, staring at us. Then, without warning, the bluish light began to distort, as if the surrounding space was being warped. The equipment we carried immediately failed. When I looked up again, the creature had vanished, leaving behind only a scorched circle on the ground, a strange, ominous mark. But the nightmare wasn't over. From the shadows, the sound of footsteps began to echo, as though dozens of entities were drawing closer. Flashlights scanned the darkness, but revealed nothing except faint, shifting silhouettes, moving like a swirling black fog. One team member suddenly screamed as he was dragged to the ground. When we rushed to help, he was gone. No trace, no sound. I realized I couldn't stay another minute. As I turned to run toward the control center, I felt something following me. It wasn't a tangible creature, but an oppressive presence, a heavy, invisible force pressing down with each breath. The control center door finally came into view, but when I stepped inside, the room was pitch black, entirely different from how I'd left it. It felt as if time and space were unraveling. The broken monitors cast distorted faces onto the cracked screens, emitting spine-chilling, distorted sounds. And at the center of the room stood a familiar figure, motionless, back turned toward me. It was the missing team member, but when I called out their name, they slowly turned around, revealing a face that was anything but human. Panic consumed me. As I screamed, everything around me faded into darkness. When I woke up, I found myself lying on the cold ground, surrounded by impenetrable darkness. The watch on my wrist had stopped working, as if time itself had been erased in this place. A faint light in the distance drew my attention, like a lighthouse guiding me through an endless sea of night. I moved toward it, my body heavy, as though countless unseen eyes were clinging to me. The light led me to the central area of Skinwalker Ranch, a barren field where only the scorched remnants of the strange markings we had seen before remained. But this time, the burned circle was far larger, and within it, shadowy figures spun endlessly in a ghostly dance. Whispers began to echo, though their source was indiscernible. They weren't words, but fragments of disjointed memories, laughter, screams, sobs, all merging into one cacophony that made my head feel as though it would burst. And then, for a fleeting moment, I saw the faces of my teammates, the ones who had vanished. They stood at the edge of the circle, their eyes wide and vacant, like puppets under some invisible control. A chilling wind blew past, carrying with it a sensation that didn't belong to this world. I realized then that I was no longer just an observer. I had become part of the experiment. A sharp pain shot through my body as I stepped into the scorched circle, and before I could comprehend what was happening, everything was consumed by a vortex of darkness. When the last glimmer of light faded, only silence remained. Skinwalker Ranch stood still under the vast sky, but every trace of us had completely vanished. People say that what happens in this place can never be explained, but one thing is certain: Skinwalker Ranch never lets anyone go. As the moon hung suspended in the sky like a milky, unblinking eye watching every movement below, the old cabin in the heart of the deep forest stood as a shadowy figure, isolated completely from the outside world. That night, the air carried a suffocating chill, cold as the breath of the ancient woods, where every tree and leaf seemed to whisper sinister secrets. Mark, a rugged man in his 30s, had decided to bring his group of friends here for a break from the stresses of work. Just a relaxing getaway, he'd said with a confident smile, unaware that this trip would turn to the most horrifying nightmare of their lives. Accompanying Mark were three close friends: Laura, a nature enthusiast with a sensitive soul; Chris, the joker of the group, always quick to lighten the mood; and Sophie, a sharp-minded woman who couldn't shake a deep unease whenever darkness fell. The cabin they rented was deep within the untamed wilderness of Arizona, miles away from the nearest road. It was a small, weathered wooden house, heavy with the weight of time. Everything in the cabin seemed to creak and groan. The doors swayed and squeaked with the wind, and the floorboards murmured faintly under every step. As night descended, they gathered around the flickering fire in the hearth. Laura suddenly asked, "Have you guys ever heard of the Skinwalker legend?" The question sent an involuntary shiver through the group, not because they believed, but because of how Laura said it. Her voice trailed off, and her gaze drifted toward the slightly open window, as if something out there might be listening. "Skinwalker? You mean those shape-shifting creatures from Navajo folklore?" Chris chuckled, trying to dispel the growing tension. But Sophie didn't laugh. She sat quietly, her eyes fixed on the pitch-black forest outside the window. "Don't joke about it, Chris. We shouldn't talk about them in a place like this." Sophie's voice faltered, and though the group didn't understand her fear, her tone was enough to unsettle them. Suddenly, a strange sound echoed from somewhere deep in the woods, a faint, drawn-out screech, as though some creature were clawing at the air itself to make a sound. Laura immediately stood and stepped toward the window. She squinted into the darkness, but saw nothing beyond the thick veil of shadows. "It's just the wind," Mark reassured them, though he couldn't hide the unease creeping into his own chest. But was it really the wind? Or was it the mocking laughter of something lurking in the shadows, waiting to strike? The small cabin in the heart of the forest suddenly felt stifling, as though every corner screamed for them to leave while they still could. But they didn't hear the warnings, and they would pay the price. When the clock in the cabin struck midnight, the group remained awake, each lost in their own thoughts amidst the cold and eerie stillness of the ancient forest. The fire in the hearth flickered weakly, its dying embers casting a faint red glow, unable to dispel the oppressive gloom creeping into the cabin. Outside the window, the darkness loomed like a thick curtain draped over everything, denying the moonlight's touch on the earth below. Gusts of wind whistled through the cracks in the wooden walls, carrying sounds that resembled whispers from another world. Chris was the first to notice something strange. He rose to his feet and almost unconsciously moved toward the window as though something beyond it was calling him. His gaze landed on the clearing in front of the cabin, the very spot where they had laughed and chatted only hours ago as they roasted meat over the fire. Now, that same clearing felt unnaturally still, too quiet, too empty. In the shadows near the edge of the tree line, Chris spotted a footprint. No, it was a trail of footprints embedded deeply into the damp earth, leading from the forest toward the cabin. These prints didn't resemble anything he'd ever seen, not human, not animal. They were enormous, with long claw-like toes, and each step left a disturbingly clear impression, as though the creature had been stalking deliberately. "Mark!" Chris called out softly, his voice trembling, though even he wasn't sure whether it was from fear or the chill. But Mark didn't hear him. He was by the hearth, rearranging a few logs to keep the fire alive. At this moment, Laura, who was always sensitive to the atmosphere around her, began to sense that something was wrong. She walked over to Chris, her eyes following his line of sight. When she saw the strange footprints, her heart tightened and a cold shiver ran down her spine. "We're not alone out here," Laura whispered, her eyes wide with alarm. Inside the cabin, the air grew heavier. Sophie, ever cautious and reserved, sat curled up in a corner, feeling more certain than ever that something was watching them. Outside, another sound broke the silence. This time, it wasn't the wind. It was a deep, drawn-out noise like something or someone scratching against tree bark or the ground. The sounds came from multiple directions, surrounding the cabin as though the forest itself had come alive, speaking to them in a language they couldn't understand. Mark finally noticed the tension. He walked to the window, studying the footprints carefully. Before he could say anything, Laura pointed to another spot in the shadows where the faint remnants of their earlier campfire revealed another set of prints, closer to the cabin this time. They weren't just static, they were moving, overlapping, as though the creature was circling the cabin, inspecting every corner. "All right, that's enough. We can't stay here anymore," Laura said abruptly, her voice cutting through the unnerving silence. Mark frowned. "Calm down. It's probably just tracks from some wildlife. This forest is full of animals." But Mark's words did little to reassure anyone, including himself. Though his rational mind tried to dismiss it, the growing unease had already taken root in all of them. As they turned back into the cabin, Sophie suddenly froze. She caught a scent, something sharp and acrid, like burnt animal fur. The smell wafted in through the cracks in the door, impossible to ignore. "They're getting closer," Sophie murmured, her voice tinged with dread. Mark quickly grabbed a large flashlight and gestured for everyone to gather. "Stay calm, everyone. We can't panic. It's just our imagination, okay?" But deep in his eyes, a fear he couldn't hide had begun to surface. None of them knew that this was only the beginning. Outside, in the pitch-black darkness of the forest, the mysterious creature was inching closer, its presence becoming more tangible with every passing second. Inside the cabin, the atmosphere grew suffocating, as though the darkness outside was slowly encroaching with every breath they took. The sound of wind whistling through the cracks grew louder, carrying an eerie noise, like distorted, unnatural laughter. The glow from the fireplace began to wane, casting flickering shadows on the walls that seemed to shift and hide something lurking in the cramped space of the cabin. Chris kept his eyes fixed on the window. The beam from his flashlight barely lit a few meters beyond the edge of the forest, but it did nothing to ease the chill running down his spine. The strange footprints had disappeared, yet the unnatural silence of the forest remained. Suddenly, Laura let out a small scream, pointing toward a distant corner where the faint light of the dying campfire flickered. A shadow darted past in a blur, moving too quickly to discern its shape. The cabin's cold embrace became suffocating, as if it had transformed from a safe haven into a trap. No one spoke, but they all understood that the presence they felt was not imagined. Deep within, each of them sensed a primal fear, an inexplicable, gut-wrenching certainty that they were being hunted. In a corner of the cabin, Sophie clutched her coat tightly, her eyes locked on the fireplace's dwindling embers. The acrid smell that had lingered earlier now grew stronger, filling every corner of the room. It felt as though a cold breath brushed against the back of her neck, but when she turned, there was only the empty void of darkness. Outside, the strange noises began again. Footsteps, sometimes heavy, sometimes light, seemed to approach the cabin. Occasionally, the sharp crack of branches breaking would echo, making the group jump in unison. They dared not move or speak. Time felt frozen, leaving only their terror suspended in the air. Chris slowly approached the door, gripping his flashlight tightly. He strained to listen, but all he could hear was the pounding of his own heart. Suddenly, a sharp metallic screech, like claws dragging across wood, pierced the silence, freezing everyone in place. The sound seemed to tear through the air itself. Outside, a large shadow loomed across the window, barely visible in the faint light. Its form was indistinct, a monstrous black mass moving with unnerving speed. It didn't resemble a human or an animal, at least not entirely. Inside, Laura dropped to her knees, her trembling hands clutching the edge of the table as she tried to pray silently. But her whispers were drowned out by a deafening thud. The front door shook violently, as though something was slamming into it with terrifying force. The fire in the hearth extinguished completely, leaving only the weak beam of Chris's flashlight. Darkness, like a living entity, seeped into the cabin, wrapping around everything. The sense of being surrounded became overwhelming. Chris stepped back, his eyes fixed on the door. But before he could act, a series of rhythmic knocks came from the left window. then the right. The sounds were deliberate, like long, sharp fingers tapping lightly against the glass, sending shivers through everyone inside. Sophie, unable to bear it any longer, began to cry silently. It felt as though the creature outside was toying with them, relishing their terror. The steady knocking, the distorted laughter, and the grotesque shadow at the window all confirmed that they had become prey in a sadistic game. In that moment, the group realized this was no ordinary creature. It wasn't just hunting them. It was sowing chaos and fear, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. In the cramped cabin, the air was thick with fear. The door continued to shudder intermittently, as though something outside was testing it, preparing for a final push. Chris stared at it intently, gripping the box cutter he had grabbed from the kitchen corner. Yet deep down, he knew this flimsy weapon was useless against the horror lurking beyond. The rhythmic tapping on the window suddenly ceased, replaced by a deathly silence. At first, the group exhaled in relief, but the oppressive atmosphere only grew heavier, signaling that the worst was yet to come. Laura trembled as she backed against the cold wooden wall, while Sophie tried to stifle her ragged breathing with her hands. Then, the door stopped moving. Chris kept his eyes fixed on it, his heart pounding like a drum as he struggled to distinguish reality from illusion. From the darkness came a new sound, heavy footsteps on the roof of the cabin. The movements were slow and deliberate, as though the creature was savoring each moment of its prey's entrapment. The roof creaked, and then a large shadow slid across the window. Chris stumbled backward as he saw a pair of glowing eyes piercing through the darkness. They were unlike any human or animal eyes he had ever seen. Two pale yellow orbs, hollow and emotionless, yet brimming with an indescribable dread. Chris opened his mouth to scream, but another sound interrupted him, the splintering of glass. The window pane behind them shattered, and a gust of icy wind rushed in, carrying a nauseating stench. Laura shrieked as a hairy, clawed hand reached through the frame, its black talons curling over the edge. But the hand lingered only for a moment before retreating, as if taunting them. Panic reached a fever pitch as the group realized they were under attack from all sides. Sophie screamed as a sudden wailing sound emanated from beneath the cabin's floorboards. Something was scratching and clawing at the wood, sending splinters falling to the ground. The darkness seemed to come alive, seeping into every corner of the cabin. "They're everywhere," Chris whispered, his panicked eyes darting around the room. His words needed no explanation. Everyone could feel it. The Skinwalker was no longer just a creature lurking in the shadows. It was the shadows, infiltrating every crevice and consuming every shred of hope. Without warning, the ceiling cracked, and a grotesque figure crashed through, surrounded by splinters and debris. The group screamed in unison as the creature emerged under the dim light. Its distorted form defied definition, shifting between a massive wolf-like beast and a gaunt, skeletal human figure. Only its glowing yellow eyes remained constant, staring into the deepest fears of those before it. Chris lunged forward with the small knife in his hand, but the creature swatted him away effortlessly, sending him crashing into a corner. Blood streamed from his head, yet no one dared to approach him. Laura clung tightly to Sophie, both trembling as the monstrous entity advanced toward them. A low, guttural growl filled the cabin, sounding almost like mocking laughter. Abruptly, the creature stopped, lifting its head as though it had heard something outside. Its glowing eyes scanned the room one last time before it emitted a chilling screech and disappeared into the shadows as quickly as it had appeared. The cabin fell silent again, but it was no longer a sanctuary. It was now a place marked by chaos and fear, with every wall bearing the weight of their terror. Though they were still alive, the group knew that the darkness outside had never truly left. It lingered. The cabin was now engulfed in complete darkness, filled only with the labored breaths of Laura and Sophie amidst the stifling air thick with mold and blood. Chris lay motionless in the corner, a dark red streak of blood running down his forehead. Laura approached him hesitantly, her trembling hand pressing against his neck to check for signs of life. "He's still breathing," Laura whispered, but the relief in her voice was quickly replaced by terror as the scratching sounds resumed, this time coming from all directions. The small wooden cabin was no longer a refuge, but a trap, holding them captive in a nightmare. Laura and Sophie dragged Chris to the darkest corner of the cabin, where the dim light from the dying flashlight could no longer reach. "What do we do now?" Sophie whispered, tears streaming down her pale face. No one answered. Outside, the darkness seemed alive, pressing against the cabin like a sentient force, whispering strange, unnerving sounds. Suddenly, the flashlight went out, plunging them into complete blackness. Then it came. A thunderous crash echoed as the cabin door was torn open, seemingly by an invisible force. Icy wind flooded in, carrying shifting shadows that seemed to step into the cabin, as though the night itself had arrived to end their ordeal. Laura screamed as she saw the familiar glowing yellow eyes, this time not just one pair, but many. The twisted creatures entered the cabin, no longer hiding within the shadows. They moved like a pack of predators surrounding Laura, Sophie, and Chris. The air was heavy with the stench of decay, suffocating them. Laura stood protectively in front of Sophie and Chris, her eyes streaming with tears, yet she refused to back down. "We have nothing left to lose," Laura whispered, but her words were drowned out by the growls of the creatures. Then it happened too quickly. One of the figures lunged at Laura, dragging her into the shadows. Her scream echoed, but it was brief, swallowed by the suffocating silence that followed. Sophie clung to Chris, tears flowing as the darkness consumed them entirely. In the end, the cabin fell into utter silence. No sounds, no signs of the creatures, no trace of the people. Only the cold, empty room remained. On the old wooden table, the hunter's journal lay open, with a final scrawled warning: "The Skinwalker does not leave, it waits." The story ended there, but there was no one left to tell it. Darkness had triumphed, leaving behind a desolate cabin in the wilderness, haunting anyone who might stumble upon it. Thank you for watching till the end of the video. If you enjoyed the story, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss our next terrifying tales. Leave a comment to share your thoughts or suggestions to help us improve. See you in the next video, and have a peaceful night.